I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to join us. Good afternoon. This is Susan Pankowski. I'm a librarian at the West End Synagogue, and I'm the moderator today for the JCC's Tuesday Talks. And we are going to be listening to Kate Stewart talk about her book, A Well-Read Woman, The Lives, Loves, and Legacy of Ruth Rappaport. I'll give you guys a few minutes to get online, and then we will begin our book talk. Kate Stewart is a third-generation librarian. She was born and raised in the Midwest. She graduated from Vassar College with a BA in history and the University of Iowa with 2 master's degrees in history and library science. She's worked as a librarian and an archivist at the Library of Congress, the US Senate, and the Arizona Historical Society. And she currently lives in Tucson, Arizona. Kate will talk about her book, A Well-Read Woman, The Lives, Loves, and Legacy of Ruth Rappaport, a biography of a Jewish librarian and journalist whose career in military libraries in Vietnam and at the Library of Congress was shaped by living under censorship in Nazi Germany and McCarthyism in the United States. The book also explores Ruth's Jewish identity, her work in the American Zionist movement, and her experiences in Israel from 1948 to 1949. Kate, I'm so glad you're here, and I hope that you're doing well there. I look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen because I have some photos to share that are, most of these are in the book. Some of them are not. This is the cover. So Ruth was, as you can see, a well-read woman among many other things. And there's a whole lot I could talk about today, but I was going to focus primarily on kind of the first half of her life, which deals a lot with her Jewish identity and what she went through. It was a very turbulent time in the earlier part of her life. And okay, let me see. So Ruth grew up in Germany. This is her father, Mendel, who was not from Germany. He was from Romania, and he was an immigrant like many Jews were in Germany at this time. This is him in 1918. He was in World War I, serving for the Romanian military, even though he had already moved to Germany at that point, but they sent him back to Romania to serve there. And he had come like many immigrants, searching for better work opportunities. And he came to work as a furrier in Leipzig, Germany. And he came, I believe, around 1900, from what I remember. These are Ruth's parents when they got married in 1922, just before she was, I guess about a year before she was born. Her mother was from Poland, and a fun fact about her mother was a cousin of hers was Helena Rubinstein, the famous makeup business owner who came from Poland to first Australia and then New York, and owned a famous makeup business. That Ruth always liked to mention that fact. But they both, I think they met in Leipzig, as far as I can tell, and got married. Her father had been married twice before and was widowed both times and had a daughter from each marriage. So Ruth had two older half sisters who were a lot older than her. And this is her. I'm not sure when this was taken or how old exactly she was. I think maybe this was taken, the one on the left, in front of her apartment building in Leipzig. She lived in like a really large apartment building in this neighborhood that was known as the Graphics Quarter, which is an important part of this story, because Leipzig was a really famous publishing city, which I'll talk about in a second. This is one, I really like this photo. You can tell, I'm not sure how old she was in this photo either, maybe about 10 or in early teenage years. She's already wearing glasses because she read so much. She was such a big bookworm. But another important thing about this photo, of course, it's from her passport. You can see she was born in Germany. She was born in Leipzig, but she was not considered a German citizen. She was considered a foreigner or an immigrant. And this is, I think, kind of an important thing I talk about kind of throughout the book, that she was kind of always considered an outsider or a foreigner wherever she was, even though she eventually gained American citizenship. But I don't think she ever fully felt, like she really belonged. Exactly. All these places that she lived throughout the world, she was always kind of marked as an outsider from where she was very first born. So this is Leipzig. This is the main town square in Leipzig, it's a famous city if you've ever been there. It's known for its classical music. Bach and Mendelssohn lived there. It's just this world famous cultural city, and especially its publishing industry. It was kind of like the premier publishing city in the world in the early 20th and late 19th century. They had this huge book fair. It was an international book fair every year. There were thousands of publishers that lived in this city, and in particular the neighborhood that Ruth grew up in, called the Graphics Quarter. In fact, there were even publishers who operated businesses out of the apartment building that she lived in. They had, booksellers, printers that worked out of these little apartments, which I thought was kind of neat. So she grew up in this culture where everybody had books. They were everywhere, and all kinds of stuff that I think was kind of well beyond what we would consider probably appropriate for kids to read today. Stuff about, communism or philosophy, or just really advanced stuff that she was reading as a kid and a teenager. And this became really important in 1933 when the Nazis came to power. She was 10 years old, and she had these very vivid memories of seeing book burnings on the street and how shocking this was to her. And before we talk more about books, this is the synagogue that she went to. There were several synagogues that popped up in the early 20th century to kind of accommodate. There were so many Jews moving into Leipzig that I think 3 of them were built kind of around the same time. And she had this famous rabbi that led this synagogue, one of the members of the Karlbach family, if you know that, the famous rabbi family that was all around Europe. One of them led this synagogue. She had memories of him. And he also led her Jewish high school too. And this group, Ruth belonged to a Zionist youth group as a kid. She joined it very early on. And this was really important because this was kind of a radical group for the time. The one that she belonged to was very working class and also kind of communist. and was very much in favor of this angle that, of course, it's a Zionist group. They were really telling the kids there that they needed to leave Germany immediately when Hitler came to power, even if their parents didn't necessarily agree with that. This was something that the group was trying to tell the kids, you know, that you should leave despite what your parents say, if you had a way to leave. And besides that message, I mean, of course, they did stuff like sports and some other fun activities. They went camping. But one thing they started doing after 1933 was they had this network of reading banned books together, where I don't know how they got them, if they already owned them or if they were able to get them in some kind of black market. But they shared them amongst each other, and when they were all done reading them, they destroyed them. And Ruth talked about this in this oral history that she did. This is Ruth's mother and sister, probably in front of their apartment building in 1937. I think her sister had already moved to Israel at this point, or Palestine, a few years earlier, and was back on a trip. And this, her other sister, who was even older than Miriam, her sister Clara, had moved to France with her boyfriend at the time, who she later married. And you can tell all three of these sisters were getting out of Germany. Ruth also wanted to leave. She was not quite sure where at this point as a teenager, probably the US. Her mother had 3 uncles who lived in Seattle. And this was a place where Ruth and her parents were thinking about moving. And Ruth is also considering going to Palestine to live with Miriam at this time. And I really love this. This is probably one of my favorite photos of Ruth. If you notice the date on here, which I think is really significant, November 8th, 1938. This is the day before Kristallnacht. And I think it's fascinating that you see this really tranquil domestic scene of her just doing this everyday activity of putting up laundry. And Ruth had gotten a camera just maybe a year before this, so there's tons of photos of her, kind of like the original selfies, you know, back in the 1930s, of her and her friends doing all this kind of fun stuff together, even in the midst of all this kind of horrific stuff happening, going on behind the scenes that Ruth had really vivid memories of in her oral histories that she did. And so just a day later, during Kristallnacht, Ruth, she gave an account about what happened. She went out that night during Kristallnacht and saw what happened. She saw her synagogue burned down and her school was closed down. She wanted to go out and see what happened. And she wasn't, her parents had, I think, didn't want her to go out and had told her not to go out, but she went anyway. And she had thought of it as like, as being like a reporter, and she would rather know what was going on than to not know what was happening, even though it was incredibly dangerous. So right after Kristallnacht, her school was closed, this Jewish school that she'd been attending, and her mother had been planning this trip to Switzerland for a while to go there to this spa for health reasons. Her mom had some health issues. So her parents decided that Ruth should go with her for a few weeks since she wasn't in school, and weren't quite sure what to do with her. So they went for a few weeks. They also met up with they had some distant relatives that lived in Zurich. And then on the way back, this train was leaving the station, and Ruth decided, I'm not going back to Germany. I can't do it. It's too dangerous. And so she, even though her mother didn't agree with her, I'm assuming that they had some kind of argument about this. So Ruth grabbed her suitcase and jumped off the train. And she was 15 at the time, and I don't think she had much of a plan. She may have gone to her relatives, but they did not allow her to stay with them. So she ended up staying in a Salvation Army women's home, like a home for a shelter, basically a homeless shelter, for a few weeks. And then she got hooked up with an organization that was started. Oh, here's a photo of Kristallnacht. This is, I think, the synagogue, or one of the synagogues. I'm not sure if this is the one that Ruth went to, that was burned down in Leipzig. So Ruth ended up in Zurich for a year and got hooked up with this organization that was started by 2 Jewish women to help kids get out of Germany, Jewish kids. And they were the ones who started the Kindertransport trains that left Germany for Switzerland and for England. And Ruth was actually on this list of, I went to the archives in Zurich, where this organization has their records. And I found a file about Ruth and this list of kids who were on the kinder transport. And Ruth is on that list, even though she wasn't on the train, she was already in Zurich, but they got her on that list as a way of just letting her have permission to stay in Switzerland for a while. But part of this organization, what they did was they found foster families for Jewish kids to stay with. So Ruth stayed with several foster families over her year there. The first family did not like her and wanted to send her back. There was a letter about that. They thought she was too independent for a teenager, and because she wanted to kind of go off and do things on her own in the city, and they didn't like that. This is the second family that she lived with, the Herzogs, and she was basically sort of like a nanny for their little daughter. And then she ended up living with several other Jewish families who she joined another Zionist youth group and met some families there, and ended up staying with them for the rest of the time she was there for. She was there for about a year in total before she was going to the U.S. consulate all the time by herself, trying to figure out if she could still get a visa, because she and her parents had applied back in Germany, and then once she got to Switzerland, she found out that was no longer valid. She had to start the whole process over to try to get to the U.S. And she did that all by herself, going to the U.S. consulate probably about once a week for about a year, and trying to navigate that whole bureaucracy by herself as a 15-year-old and then 16-year-old. And this is another photo I really love of her writing. And there are all these diaries that she kept while she was in Zurich. So I like to think this is one that she wrote. I have no idea what she's writing. She could be writing something else, but I know that she loved to read, she loved to write. So this is a photo that I especially love. And this is the other Zionist youth group that she belonged to in Zurich. They did this trip that she really loved, where they marched all the way to France over the summer and stayed at this castle. I think this may be a photo from that trip that she took. Ruth was taking photos all the time. She loved to take photos. Although she wrote a lot in her diary about being very lonely in Zurich and kind of wondering if she should have stayed in Germany. She felt like she was not getting along well with the other kids, that they didn't really understand her and her situation very well. But she loved this trip. So then Ruth got her visa to go to Seattle, and did this all on her own. She took a ship from Amsterdam to New York and met her aunt and uncle there. They were waiting for her, and took a train all the way across the country to Seattle. And so she had her three uncles living there. This is one of them, Carl, who was a very successful businessman who had came from Poland around, I think, 1905. Started with nothing. He started like a fruit stand and worked his way up and owned several businesses, including, you might remember Rubenstein canned salmon. I think they still make that brand of canned salmon. He owned several distilleries. He was involved in all kinds of business activities in Seattle. So Ruth lived with him for a while, and his wife, and he had two kids who had been born in the U.S. and raised in America. And but she really didn't feel like she fit in very well in the U.S. and with her family over there. Like, she felt really like the odd man out, and she was kind of, again, like this weird foreigner. Struggled a little bit in high school, she had started to learn English in Germany, but was kind of struggling with that in high school for a little while. She did end up joining, this is the synagogue that she belonged to, the Herzl Synagogue. That's her up at the top. And this was a wonderful kind of safe haven for her. And the rabbi, is right behind her to the left, who's a really wonderful guy, she actually knew him in Germany. He was a rabbi there in a nearby town who had done a lot of youth activities. So she already knew him when he came after she did to Germany, and they became really good friends. He was sort of like a mentor to her. And she was very close with his family, and she and the rabbi also developed kind of this great close group of German Jews who were kind of exiles in Seattle, and they had dinner together a lot. And she had this nice close group of friends. This is another one of her in Seattle, I think probably taken at her Uncle Carl's house, I'm guessing. That may be her cousin, the American cousin I'm thinking of in that wedding photo in the background, maybe, because she talked about going to that wedding in her diary. So Ruth, she went to college at the University of Washington for a little bit, but she did not graduate there. She had this series of jobs that she kind of hated as a secretary, and she worked in some stores. She was kind of always one of those people who was always arguing with her boss about, she disagreed with how things should be run. But she had, she was a member of the synagogue she joined. She was eventually became the president of her local junior Hadassah group and some other Zionist groups she was very involved with. As things were progressing in Palestine, she really became very involved with that movement. And then she eventually became the editor of this newspaper, the Jewish Transcript. It was also called the Transcript. This was Seattle's local Jewish newspaper. This is a really terrific job for her. I think she really loved it. She may have gotten this job during the war because all the men were away, possibly. That's kind of one of my guesses, is that they had a slew of women take over during the war. But I think she really loved it. It gave her a chance to really meet a whole bunch of people involved in Zionism, in the Jewish community all over the West Coast. I should mention too, after World War II, I think it took about a year until she finally found out her parents had stayed in Germany. She hardly heard anything from them, just maybe like one or two letters after she left. And then after all this back and forth writing to different organizations, she found that they died in concentration camps in Germany, and as did her brother-in-law. Her older sister, Clara's husband, had been deported from France to Auschwitz, and she never talked about it in her oral history. The person who interviewed her tried to ask about it, but she really wouldn't talk about it. It was extremely traumatic to find out what had happened to them. And she did go through the whole restitution process later in the 1950s, and won restitution eventually. Took like about 10 years. But Ruth got recruited when the Zionist Organization of America, they started opening up offices, and they opened up one in 1947 in San Francisco. So Ruth went there to be kind of like the office manager, and was there for about 6 months until she heard from her sister Miriam in Palestine that she had been married for a few years, Miriam had, and her husband had been shot and killed. He was a guard in the kind of paramilitary group, which I'm forgetting the name of right now, that had started protecting, the new Jewish residents of Palestine. So he was shot and killed at the end of 1947. And Miriam asked Ruth to come live with her for a while in Israel. So Ruth said yes. She'd always wanted to go there. She thought, a great opportunity. She thought maybe she could possibly get a job as a journalist. She thought it would be good for her career. Maybe she could write something, maybe write a book about her experience there. She knew that something was going to happen. Everybody kind of knew that the state of Israel was probably coming soon. So she wanted to kind of be a part of that. This is a photo of her passport, her American passport, that she got right before she left to go there. And this is her in Israel in 1948. And although she looks very happy, she was quite miserable there. She lived with, I'm not sure if she lived with Miriam. I think she lived in the same apartment building as her in Jerusalem during the first half of 1948, which is during most of the war. And it was a really horrible experience. She almost starved to death. She lost a ton of weight because there was food shortages. The city was under siege for many months. She was shot at many times, and buildings next to her were bombed and destroyed. It's a really horrible situation. She did get a job briefly as a photographer for Acme News, but she really struggled to find a permanent job, and she was losing money. She had brought some savings with her, but the cost of living there was outrageous. She thought that people were not being very supportive of each other during this stressful time. Although she did go out, I love this photo I think that she took of, she eventually got a job working in this new press office at the end of 1948 when the state was founded. And I think these are her work buddies. They would go out drinking a lot. She did a lot of partying there. She wrote about this a lot in her her diary. But she just did not enjoy herself there. She had a really rough time, and was really disillusioned, I think, overall with Israel and how things were going in the country. And she really had this crisis of, she wasn't sure what to do with her life at this point. She didn't know, should I go back to the US? And if so, what am I going to tell everybody after I've been so involved in the Zionist movement and I don't really quite believe in it anymore? And she wasn't sure about her career either. Like, she was working as this photograph archivist. That wasn't quite what she wanted to do. She wasn't sure if she pursue journalism or what. So she kind of stalled, and she kept working at this job for another year, even though she hated it, actually complained about it a lot in her diary, but didn't know what to do with her life. And it's an agonizing time to read about all in her diary. But she did decide to go back to the US. First, she went to New York. And this is a really fascinating little interlude. She worked for a while for this man named Max Lowenthal, who lived in New York, and was a lawyer who has his own fascinating backstory that I kind of want to pursue some more research about him and write something about him, because nobody's really written about him before. He was a lawyer who worked in government for a long time. He worked for FDR and then was a very close friend and advisor to Harry Truman, did a lot of stuff behind the scenes in government at that level. And then he, for years, he'd been compiling all this work and research on the FBI and all their abuses of civil liberties and violating them for citizens. And so he wrote this book about the FBI that he had tried to get published for a long time, but J. Edgar Hoover had tried to suppress the publication of it. He had threatened all these publishers who were interested in putting it out. But he was finally able to find a publisher who's willing to do it in 1950. And he hired Ruth to kind of help with the end of this process of checking all the footnotes and references and helping him with the publicity of sending this book out to hundreds of newspapers and people all over the country when it finally came out. And there was this kind of firestorm of controversy when it came out in the newspapers. It's just a fascinating little story. And I think Ruth learned a lot about that. I think, she had faced all these incidences of censorship, both in Germany. Also, I should also mention too, in Israel, that was something that really bothered her when she worked at this press office. She knew that the press officers were lying to the press about stuff that was going on, and that really bothered her. And then she dealt with it again in the US, working for Max Lowenthal, and seeing that people like J. Edgar Hoover had the power to try to stop the publication of this book, even though he wasn't totally successful in doing that. So then Ruth, after trying to figure out what to do with her life, she finally decided, she was in her late 20s, I think, when she decided to go back to college. And she moved to Berkeley and went to school at Berkeley, finished her undergrad degree there in sociology, and then went to library school also at Berkeley. And that took her a long time. She was working during the day at military bases as a typist and taking classes at night, a bunch of classes that she failed. She had some health issues, like she was in a car accident and had all these problems, but it took her a long time to finally graduate and get her library degree. But she finally did in the late 50s. And she became a librarian, first with the Air Force, and went to Japan for a few years. Experience that I don't think she liked very much. It was kind of an isolated Air Force bases and very sexist situation. Then she got a job. She saw a job ad for the Navy was hiring a librarian in Saigon. There was no library really there to speak of. And they wanted somebody to build up this library system across all of Vietnam, because they knew they were going to be sending all these troops there in 1963 and wanted somebody to start building libraries there. So she took this on and was there for 8 years, believe it or not, till 1970, I think. And all kinds of crazy stuff happened while she was there building these libraries. She hired a ton of people to manage these libraries. I don't know. I wouldn't want to give away all the things that happened, because there's a lot of crazy things. I should probably wrap this up soon because I know we want to do questions. But this is really one of the most fascinating parts of the book. She built all these. She built a system of delivering books and magazines. Her boss was kind of running some sort of money laundering, possibly scheme with the CIA, dropping money in different currencies, using the library system to do that. Like he hired this other guy to work for her. And he would take money out of his safe and put it in magazines and drop them to different libraries and kind of pass it on to different people. So, and this is a big question that I have. I interviewed him when I found this out because he had written about it. He had written his own kind of memoir, and that's how I found out about it. And I wondered, did she know this was going on? And he thinks that he had no idea. Maybe she did, maybe she didn't. But lots of fascinating stuff happened while she was in Vietnam for 8 years. But she ended up, of course, I kind of wonder, why did she work for the military for that long? And I think she did it for these troops. She knew a lot of them were struggling, hated being sent over there, and books were kind of their one escape. And I think she'd felt that too as a kid. I think books were her escape when she was struggling through really difficult times, and she wanted to make sure they could have something good to read. They could read whatever they wanted. She had all kinds of, she had anti-war books on like the civil rights movement, all kinds of political and interesting things going on that she was not gonna suppress them or kind of hide them. There were some librarians who were trying to hide the anti-war, like if there was a cover of a magazine about the anti-war movement, some of the librarians were trying to like hide this stuff and not put it out on the rack. And she got really angry about that kind of thing and would make sure that the troops had access to everything that they wanted. So in 1971, Ruth moved to DC and she got a job at the Library of Congress as a cataloger, and did that job for over 20 years. Eventually she became a manager of this department that did sociology cataloging. And there was also a lot of controversy about that, believe it or not. And I write about that, about subject headings and how subject headings were changed. This is something a lot of people don't know about in library world, unless you're a librarian, but Library of Congress keeps this kind of standardized vocabulary of subject headings and it's called a controlled vocabulary. And they decide the terms that are used of a subject heading. That's, like if you're using an old card catalog and you're looking up the subject heading. And a lot of people were starting to get angry about these terms that were used that were sort of like sexist and racist. And so Ruth was kind of caught up in the middle of that and being one of the people who was kind of fighting to get a lot of these headings changed. That was kind of like one of the last things she did in her professional life. And then she retired in the early 90s and lived on Capitol Hill for quite a long time after that, and was involved in lots of organizations, did all kinds of stuff on Capitol Hill. She started a Jewish group there because there was no synagogue on Capitol Hill. So she started a little Jewish community group and was involved in all kinds of stuff and was known as this kind of famous storyteller. And she would sit on the front porch and all the neighbors would come by and listen to all these amazing stories about her life. And that's how I found out about her, was by going to her estate sale. One of my coworkers was a really good friend of hers and the executor of her estate. And he invited me to her estate sale. And I went and bought a bunch of her stuff and was just really captivated by her life. So I'll stop there and we can answer questions now.
Thank you so much, Kate. This was great. I'm amazed at the amount of research that you did. I wanted to see how long the book was, and the last 50 pages or so are things like notes and your bibliography and an index, a very thorough index, although I will say, as a librarian, I wanted you to say Hadassah, Jr.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I was an indexer.
Right, yeah.
But I really was very impressed with the depth of the research, and the only thing I wish you had done is put in a timeline, because I got very confused. but the amount of detail that you did, and the amount of work that you must have done to go to the places where Ruth lived, and the fact that you dug through all of these archives, just amazing. I was very, very happy to have read the book.
Thanks.
And I don't know about anybody else, but I'm a Hadassah member, and I was very interested in the fact that she was a member of Junior Hadassah right at the very beginning of the state of Israel. And I know that that was part of her motivation, a small part of her motivation to move there.
Yeah.
What else? What kind of research did you do through Hadassah?
That was really interesting, because so in her collection of papers that are at most of her papers are at the Holocaust Museum in DC. That's where Peter donated a lot of them from her earlier part of her life. And there are all these letters about Junior Hadassah from Ruth to the woman who was the head of it at the time in New York, because Ruth was complaining about other girls in the group, that they were not taking it as seriously as she was. And after she was president for a year, and then after she was president, she was just not happy with the girl who was the president after she was, and all these back and forth letters. I think the woman who was the head of it in New York was just really irritated with her complaining so much. So that was a part of it. And then I also went to I'm kind of forgetting the exact name of it, but there's a big Jewish archives in New York. And
was it Evo?
Probably. They have a big collection of where all the Hadassah papers are. And I went there to look through to see if they had some records of the Seattle group. And they had a little bit. They had like one thing that was really interesting was to see their fundraising reports that were coming in from Seattle. And you could see that when Ruth was president, the fundraising when she was president for their group just went way up. Like, she was clearly an excellent president. Like, she did so much while she was the head of it, and then it kind of went back down after. I think she was just really irritated because, she was from Germany. She knew what was happening there. She knew the situation too in Israel. I think she's probably getting letters from her sister, reading all the news, versus I think some of the other girls who grown up in the US, I don't know if they had the same level, they didn't seem to care as much, or they saw it as this venue for like the social hour of, we're going to have tea or have a party, whereas to her, this was this serious, life or death situation, and I think it wasn't, and this was, I think, before World War II had ended. It may have been during World War II, I think, when she was very, very involved in it. And you could tell, I think that there was kind of this contingent in Seattle of Jews who were just not that into the Zionist movement. I think she had these fights with her relatives about it. They were not that into it, and she wanted them to support it more. And it wasn't really until after World War II when people really found out all the news that was coming out about the Holocaust. Then, of course, there was all the support later, and I think she felt kind of vindicated. Unfortunately, I'm sure she felt terrible, but it was this real struggle, I think, with her and other members of the community there, that she felt like an outsider and that they didn't really believe her, what she was saying. Yeah. Anyway.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about something that happened last week and happens every year, and that's Banned Book Week.
Oh, yeah.
And here we have like the epitome of the person who she embodied anti-censorship. She saw from the very beginning of the problems in Germany what it was like to not be allowed to read what you want, to have your books be burned. And I know that she spent so much time in libraries before she actually came to the conclusion to become a librarian. But if you could talk more about how you researched all that about her views on censorship and her journey.
Sure. It was a lot of that was very piecemeal, like things that, she said in her oral history, like about seeing book burnings and reading banned books with her friends. She also mentioned like the interviewer asked her, so what were your favorite authors as a teenager? And she said all the forbidden books, like that's what she loved the most, which I thought was hilarious. And then in her diaries too, she kind of mentioned these things kind of here and there, like I think that's something when you're writing a diary, you don't really think about, I'm going to list all the books I've read. I don't think people, I mean, maybe they do if you're really, I just don't think she was really thinking about doing that in the way that I would have wanted her to, but she kind of mentioned here and there books. She was reading like one, and she was in Israel, that she read was Strange Fruit, which I knew had been banned in the US. But there were just kind of little things here and there. And then like the stuff about Vietnam that I was kind of piecing again through letters that she wrote to people, like mentioning the stuff about Playboy and how people were upset that she was giving it out. And then also, I went to the ALA archives, and they're at the University of Illinois, because I knew they had some stuff about military librarians there and some stuff from conferences. And I was able to find like, they did a whole panel session at ALA about what books should military guys in the military be reading during the Vietnam War. And they had like a priest on the panel and a guy who was one of the heads of the big publishing companies. They didn't have any librarians, of course, on the panel at ALA, which of course, but just little things like that I was trying to kind of build this context, even though it's kind of hard sometimes to know, since she wasn't always very forthright in her letters and diaries, like, I think this explicitly, you have to kind of piece together, kind of guess what she was thinking about things. But of course I knew this about her censorship views from her oral history. That was probably where she was most explicit about it, but it was really fun to kind of, when I was first thinking like, what am I going to write about, in this book, like I have to kind of have a theme to kind of tie it all together. And that was kind of something that kept emerging. So when I latched onto that, I was like, all right, this is what I'm going to do. This is going to be a really fun thing to write about. And I was always kind of looking for that when I was doing the research.
So I have a question from Terry Minnan. She wants to know, was Ruth in Israel when the state was established, and what did she write about that experience as a Zionist?
Yeah, she was there. She first came in like January of 1948 and was there in Jerusalem for about the first 6 months or so when it was under siege. And she was working as a little bit as a war photographer for about a month at that time, and then moved to Tel Aviv, I think in the summer or the fall, I can't quite remember, and lived in Tel Aviv until the end of 1949. I was working in this press office, and so she really saw things up close. She was at all these press conferences where there were, like the people who were in charge, the heads of state. She always claimed that she met Golda Meir, and she did. Well, it's funny how she claims that she met her in San Francisco earlier before she went to Israel, but I don't think that's really true after trying to piece all this together. But she did mention meeting her in Israel, and being kind of embarrassed when she met her because this guy was hitting on her at the time when she was listening to her give a talk, and she was like, this guy needs to leave me alone. But yeah, she wrote a lot in her diary at that time about her kind of mixed feelings about all this happening. Like I remember, I guess it was in May when the state was first established in May of 1948. And she was like, I know we should all be thrilled and happy, but I feel a sense of doom or something like that. Is the way how she put it. Like, this does not feel good to me. And she had a lot of mixed emotions about it. I think in some respects she was happy, and she this is like what everyone had wanted for so long, but she just felt like it was going to be this endless war, I think. And she felt like this was supposed to be a homeland where we're all supposed to be safe, but she never felt safe there, whether it was from the violence. She also, she dated a lot, and she went through all this sexual harassment. She was even raped once. And she felt, her as a woman, she just felt like, I'm not safe here. And I think she kind of wondered, is the United States more safe for me? And that was kind of a letdown to kind of come to that realization. So yeah, I think very mixed emotions. Her diary is just so fascinating to read at that time. It's just incredible.
I have a question about McCarthyism and the extensive FBI checks that she went through.
Yes.
For all of her positions whenever they were.
Yeah.
How did you how did you get access to all of those?
Yes, I didn't mention that. I forgot to bring that up. Okay, so I knew that that there was this huge FBI file about Max Lowenthal. I'd read about that somewhere, and I copied some of it. Somebody copied it for me from archives at NYU that one of his sons had. So, and I figured, okay, because she worked for him, maybe there's an FBI file about her. So I did a FOIA request, which you can do for these old FBI files. Back in those days when they had, like, everyone had one about themselves. It seems like they were just tracking everybody. So I did a request. You can do this. You just fill out a form or send a letter. I forget exactly how I did it. And I guess maybe 6 months later, maybe a year later, I forget how long it took, I got this CD in the mail from them. Put it in my computer, and I saw she had like a file. I think it was over 100 pages long, and started reading through it. And I realized it had nothing to do with Max Lowenthal. Like, they never figured out that she worked for him. I think she kept that all very secretive after she left. But she had applied for a job working as a typist at an army base in Oakland. And I think this was around like 1951 or 52. And this was when Truman, for a little window of time, had passed this executive order. It's kind of like a preventative thing, because he knew that J. Edgar Hoover wanted to do something like this. And it was everyone who worked for the federal government had to be investigated, basically. If they were applying or if they were already working there, had to go through some investigation with the FBI to make sure that they were not a communist. So because she applied for that job, they started doing this investigation of her. And they found out that when she had worked in Seattle, she had given a talk to a group that was an anti-fascist group that was actually kind of a communist front group back in the 40s. And they were very suspicious of this, that all she had done was given a speech there. She wasn't really a member of the group. And because she had been in Israel, she'd also gone to Europe after Israel for a little bit to see her sister in France. She'd grown up in Germany. Of course, if you're a foreigner, you're very suspicious. So they did this huge investigation of her. It took like years, before she was finally cleared. And they just interviewed like tons of people, like over 100 people, everyone that she had ever worked with, all of her friends, family members. It was just fascinating to read through it. But they never found out that she worked for Max Lowenthal, which if they had found that out, I'm sure she would have been fired, and that would have been a huge flag. But all these people, they asked, like, do you think she's a communist? And everyone kind of said, no, not really. Like, she may read about communism, but I don't think she's a communist,
Wow. Well, I am absolutely thrilled that I was able to read this book.
Well,
and I hope that there will be a lot of other people who are interested and will continue to look for it. Please look for this book, Well Written Woman by Kate Stewart. She was fascinating, and I look forward to reading whatever you decide to write next.
Oh, thank you.